Oh, yes, yes. Yes, okay. All right, okay, no problem. All right, we're gonna go on. Okay. What is this? Hey, how's it going? Good to see you. I'm sitting right there. And
Check 1, 2.
I'll be right back.
So I'm gonna bring you up outside as soon as I see you off the roof, okay?
No, we were gonna start at 12:15 outside.
I see,
I don't
okay.
want people sitting out there and not. here. All right, great. Good afternoon. I think we're going to go ahead and get started because I really want to try and keep this on time. My name is Neil Epperson, and I'm a professor of psychiatry and obstetrics and gynecology here at the Perlman School of Medicine. I also chair the subcommittee of the University Faculty Senate, which is responsible for organizing this teach-in. So I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate seeing such a wonderful size to the, I mean, we're really filling Smilo Auditorium, and this is really like a dream come true for me. So I want to thank you today for attending the Vaccine Denial, a worldwide public health concern session. Before we get started, I want to just acknowledge a few individuals that have made this event possible. Dr. Larry Jamieson, who's Dean of the Perlman School of Medicine, and Dr. Karen Lerman, Vice Dean for Strategic Initiatives. Without them, we would not be here today, nor would we be having a really beautiful lunch after this is over. So I want to thank them for that. Also, the folks here at Smilo Building for the facilities and operations and events management, they've been terrific. I want to give a shout out to my volunteers from the undergraduate school here that have also agreed to participate, as well as some of my staff members, Emily Lipner, Aileen Norton, and Grace Ewing. Also, my right hand, Claudia Iannelli, is someone without whom I would not be able to get from A to B. Hopefully everybody has somebody like that in their life. Okay, so before we get started, you may be wondering, sort of, why have a teach-in? You know, why are we doing this now? This is the first teach-in that Penn has had in 50 years, half a century. So basically, this is just the first event of 30 that are going to occur over the course of this week. To answer the question, let's consider the actual theme of the teach-in, the academy and the 21st century, production, dissemination, and use of knowledge. I think this really highlights the importance of what we're trying to do here today, because it asks us to address the purpose of higher education. In our current climate, knowledge, which is the very currency of higher education and the academy, is being denigrated and politicized. We're told by the media and other people that facts do not matter. But here at Penn, we beg to differ. Our goal with this teach-in is to take a closer look at the role of the academy in this current climate, to demonstrate how we can discuss topics that may be controversial, but are critical to the health and well-being of our society. I hope you will visit our website. You should have gotten a printout of the calendar, but it's much easier to read on the website, and I guarantee you there are wonderful descriptions of these different events and how to get to them, as well as how to register. All these events are open to the public and free of charge. So now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel today for the vaccine denial workshop. First, you were given a card when you came in, or if you weren't given a card, you can just raise your hand and one of our student volunteers will make sure you have one. All of our speakers are going to go through 10 minutes each, and then if you have questions, please write them down on a card and gently just kind of let one of the students notice that you have a question. Pass the card down. We are not going to be taking questions from the audience through a mic. We're going to be writing these questions. Then we'll have a moderated Q&A at the end of the session. So we have a number of experts here today in vaccine technologies and development, communications, bioethics, and the media. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. David Weiner, who is Executive Vice President and Director of Vaccine and Immunotherapy Center here at the Wistar Institute. Dr. Paul Offit, Director of Vaccine Education Center and Professor of Pediatrics at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Joseph Capella, who is at the Annenberg School for Communications, where he is the Gerald R. Professor of Communications. Justin Bernstein is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Philosophy, but it will be doing his postdoc and leaving us to go to Hopkins in the fall. Dr. Damon Santola is director of the Network Dynamics Group and associate professor, also at the Annenberg School for Communication. And then we have a special guest, Mike and Scott, who is going to run our moderated Q&A. She is a senior reporter from WHYY Public Radio and host of The Pulse. So why do vaccine denial? Why focus on that as an aspect of healthcare and knowledge that comes out of the medical school? And I think you can see from this slide that there have been many luminaries in the vaccine technology world who have spent time here at Penn. And Meredith Wadman, author of The Vaccine Race, actually estimates that perhaps 4 billion persons have received vaccinations related to faculty here who have developed these technologies over the past decades. And so it seems like a very important event that the University of Pennsylvania has played a large role in that has had really worldwide implications. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Weiner. He's going to speak about developing new vaccine technologies in a complex world. This is a gentleman with more than 70 patents. He's done seminal work in DNA vaccines and immune therapies with HIV, HPV, as well as the Zika virus, and so I'm sure that he has much to share with us. Thank you. Okay, this is you. Why is he doing? Okay, here you go. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, here you go.
Thank you. Now, well, it's an honor to be here. I think this is a really important meeting, and it should be a great discussion. I'll go through my part. I'm sort of the happy face at the beginning, and then we'll go into some of the debates around it. So first I should say I work with a lot of companies, so I have a lot of conflicts, and so you shouldn't pay attention to anything I say. And basically the impact of vaccines, this is a slide showing it. The colors show vaccine cases, and then when the vaccine is introduced, and then you can see across these 6 examples, the cases go away. So not just deaths go away, hospitalizations go away. In fact, for the most part, our memory of the infection goes away. That's a big problem. We don't remember what happens when we don't get vaccinated anymore, and that's causing a lot of the issues. But to give you some numbers, this is from Jerome Kim, head of the International Vaccine Initiative. We've prevented about 3 billion infections worldwide, 500 million deaths, and prevents, it's estimated that from 2011 to 2020 will prevent 25 million deaths and 21-fold as many hospitalizations. So if you just think about the cost of that, there are not enough hospital beds across the country to house all these people should we not have this incredible, simple, relatively simple, or deceptively appearing simple technology. And of course, the savings to healthcare is enormous, a 44-to-1 ROI. However, as we go forward, our traditional vaccine space has really changed. There are really 4 major companies left that are in this space. There are a significant number of other smaller players, but really when you think about the big boys and girls, there's 4, and they have limited capacity. That means when we have outbreaks, they would have to take a product offline to put on a new product, which is taking money offline, which you can imagine is a disaster because that product also has a goal. And we have more markets, though. We used to really have 1, a pediatric market. Now we have 4 markets. Children, adolescents opened up with HPV. The adult market, which is unique, and over 55, a growing elderly population like me. And we have special needs in vaccines. We have less T cells, et cetera, et cetera. And so technologies for these populations really need to match. And that's something we didn't have to worry about in the past. And then we have growing challenges with our older technologies. Attenuation is an art form, knowing when something is really safe enough. And we have an enormous demand for safety. Just 20 significant adverse events in the entire 3 million birth cohort of the United States is enough to really put an impact on a new product. That's safer than water. Will permit more bathing accidents than we will vaccine significant adverse events. So that's a really high bar. And then we have changes in our population. We have more autoimmune disease. We had HIV. We did not have HIV before the 1980s, really, that we knew about. There were no transplants. There were really very few cancer survivors. So the number of people that have new concerns for the way we develop vaccines has really grown, and we'll need new technologies as part of our pathway going forward. And we particularly would like something that has the safety of a non-live and even for consideration. So when you consider it right from the start, and the potency of a live. And so that's sort of where our group comes in. Right here in 1992, we first reported with 3 other groups that one could simply deliver a piece of nucleic acid, non-live, non-replicating, non-spreading, into local delivery, skin or muscle, and produce an immune response. And these are not permanent, they're not gene therapy, they don't integrate, they're transient, they're very similar to a live virus attenuated vaccine, which you take, it's cleared, and you generate immune response. And of course, at this time, we cured pretty much every disease known to mouse. We were ready to open the mouse hospital next to the Roach Motel if we could get copay, but it turned out people were a little more challenging. And so while they were very safe, which was really the concept because they are non-live and they don't replicate, they really needed some help, and that's the next 20 years of work. And we eventually came up with this more technologically advanced system, which delivers, and basically you can see the impact of the delivery right here, where basically this green is delivery, and this is in the absence of the formulation delivery. So you have 1,000-fold more local delivery, but you can see it's only local. It's not outside the specific muscle that's being injected. And that translates into, if you compare the bars, into much higher immunity in people. This is a study reported by the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, led by Spiros Kalams. And we went on to do this study. We were funded for HPV therapy, where we're treating basically early neoplasia, cervical neoplasia, which has women that are at high risk of going on to develop frank cancer. And basically, it's the condition in the middle, and we're trying to vaccinate to drive it towards the right, back to clear cervix and normal tissue. And this is the outcome of that study that was reported just a few years ago in Lancet. And you can see the brown stain in the placebo, which shows cervical neoplasia, and then clearance and actually regression to normal in regression in 50% and clearance of the disease in 40%. And this has gone into an efficacy trial. But based on this technology, we've had several outbreaks, and we've been under constant onslaught from emerging infectious diseases over the last few years, and this is only going to continue because of changes in climate and encroachment and the rest. And we had worked with the U.S. government on dengue, a backup dengue vaccine, which moved forward in 18 months, and a MERS vaccine for Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And so when this happened, Gary Kobinger, head of Public Health Agency of Canada, and Heinz Feldman, head of Rocky Mountain Labs, said, I think we should take on this project and bring together companies to make it and have everyone commit right up front. We're going to move this into the clinic because it's a WHO emergency situation. There's no vaccine, no drugs. And this was these bars show how fast Zika was growing at the time. And this sort of shows what led to Pablo Tebas here in running the first clinical trial for a Zika vaccine. This was moved forward in record time for any vaccine. It took just over 6.5 months to get into a person's arm. And basically from design through production, through animal studies, protection in mice, that's brain tissue. I should mention that we also protected the testes, and that was covered by Breitbart. That's our only paper that's ever been covered by Breitbart. And we had protection in monkeys. And then, as you can see on the bottom, companies, Gene 1 and Novio, these were the universities, these were some of the lead investigators that put together a team, had to come together, review each other's data, split up assays, et cetera. And the outcome was reported just a few months ago in New England Journal of Medicine. Basically, these increasing bars show that everyone in the trial develops antibodies. This stain here shows that those antibodies can protect neuronal tissue in almost all people in the study. And then this figure, which is low on the top and then high, shows that every person tested developed antibodies that were protective when passively transferred into an animal model. And so this is the timeline. And this also just this week, just last week, made the top 10 clinical research achievement awards. So Pablo, it's really an amazing accomplishment. There were no significant adverse events. And so now we think about moving forward from here. Consistency, reproducibility, and safety, we might consider some additional technologies right up front. And so, of course, a lot of people do the work. I don't really do any work. So thank you very much. I think I'll stop there, and I might be close to being on time.
I think my AV guy is up there doing it for me. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Weiner. Now we're going to move on to our next speaker is Dr. Paul Offit, who is professor of pediatrics at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And he's basically, I think this is your most recent book, Pandora's Lab. He's going to talk to us about vaccine wars, vaccine safety, and origins of vaccine denial. Just so you know, I had to make 2 slides because Dr. Offit actually has 9 books in total, and he is not afraid of the camera, certainly not camera shy, having been on the Colbert Report, Daily Show, and a number of other venues. So, Dr. Offit, we look forward to your talk, Vaccine Wars.
Thanks, Neil. So in 10 minutes, I'm going to summarize what I think has been sort of the history of the anti-vaccine movement in the United States. So round 1 occurred, or at least in the world. Round 1 occurred with the invention of the first vaccine, which was Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine in the late 1700s. It's where the word vaccine comes from. Vacca, V-A-C-C-A, means cow in Latin. What he did was he took, what we thought he took was a cowpox virus, which would then prevent a related human smallpox. But immediately, really, there were concerns. As you can see in this James Gilray cartoon from 1804, just a few years later, people were afraid that by being inoculated with the cowpox virus, that they would start to take on bovine characteristics. And although we laugh at this today, reasonably, I would argue that some of the contentions about vaccine safety today are about as biologically plausible as this. And this is another sort of picture from the time showing fears of vaccines. Round 2 of the anti-vaccine movement was the pertussis vaccine in 1982. There was a show that aired on NBC with a veteran newscaster named Lee Thompson called DPT Vaccine Roulette. And what this showed was it was a series of children who were fine. They got this wholesale pertussis vaccine, and then they weren't fine. And so they had bicycle helmets on. They were seizing. They were staring vacantly into the sky with sort of withered arms and legs. It was a very, very powerful program. And it really gave birth in many ways, I think, to the modern American anti-vaccine movement. People like Barbara Loe Fisher, Kathy Williams, and Jeff Schwartz formed something called Dissatisfied Parents Together, which eventually became the National Vaccine Information Center, which I think really is the go-to site for the anti-vaccine movement. And within 1 month of that show occurring, Paula Hawkins, who is since deceased, but it was a Republican from Florida, held a congressional hearing to determine whether vaccines were doing more harm than good. That's Paula Hawkins there. The media coverage of that particular event, claiming that the whole cell vaccine, pertussis vaccine, caused permanent brain damage, caused a flood of lawsuits successfully claiming that the pertussis vaccine caused sudden infant death syndrome, Rise syndrome, coma, mental retardation, what was called mental retardation at the time, epilepsy, and transverse myelitis, which is a permanent cause of paralysis. Now, none of those things were true, but the fact of the matter is that played well in court. So it took a while. I think we learned from this particular episode. It really took about 10 years for us to do the kinds of epidemiological studies that showed that vaccines didn't cause sort of permanent harm like epilepsy or permanent developmental delays. And it really took 25 years to do the genetic studies that showed that many of these kids had something called Dravet syndrome, which is a genetic problem, an SCN1A mutation, a sodium channel transport mutation that has nothing to do, obviously, with getting vaccines. But these studies, and those kids invariably develop epilepsy or developmental delays in the first year of life, which is when they're getting the pertussis vaccine. And the pertussis vaccine only prevents pertussis. It doesn't prevent everything else that happens in the first year of life. But these studies, unfortunately, came far too late to stem the tide of fear caused by this vaccine. And so the price of the DTP vaccine rose from 19 cents in 1980 to $12 in 1986. The number of oral polio vaccine makers declined from 3 to 1, of measles vaccine makers from 6 to 1, and of pertussis vaccine makers from 8 to 1. And so really we were at risk of losing vaccines in the United States for America's children. And so what was born actually in the Reagan administration, not an administration necessarily known for its social programs, was the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which included the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which slowed the bleeding. And so the National Vaccine Information Center, or NVIC, continues to weigh in on vaccine safety. The notion that vaccines have merely replaced infectious diseases with chronic diseases persists, I think, especially as promoted by that group. And NVIC is a media-savvy, politically connected, passionate, and lawyer-backed group. And so whenever then new vaccines were introduced, like the Haemophilus influenza B vaccine, they were on national television claiming that it caused diabetes. For pneumococcal vaccine, claiming that it caused a permanent seizure disorder. For the hepatitis B vaccine, it was recommended for adolescents routinely, claiming that it caused multiple sclerosis. For hepatitis B vaccine, claiming when it was recommended for newborns in the early 1990s, claiming that it caused sudden infant death syndrome. And for human papillomavirus vaccine, claiming that it caused blood clots, strokes, or chronic pain or chronic fatigue syndromes. Round 3 occurred in 1998 with the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, with this publication by Andrew Wakefield in the Lancet claiming that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine caused autism. That's Andrew Wakefield there. I mean, he played very well in the United States. He's a handsome, square-jawed, passionate, well-spoken academic with a British accent. I think we're sort of all willing to give ourselves back over to the Crown at this point. We love that accent. And in fact, so popular was he that actually there was a movie made about him where he was a hero. The movie was called Hear the Silence. It was shown primarily in Europe, but he was that well known. He was on every morning and evening show here. He was on at 60 Minutes. He testified in front of congressional hearings. He now provided an answer that medicine couldn't provide. He knew what the cause of autism was, which was the MMR vaccine. Now, that wasn't true. This is one of many, a slide that shows 5 studies that would have become 17 studies that showed that when you looked at children who received the MMR vaccine or didn't receive it, there was no greater risk of autism. And then Andrew Wakefield sort of came tumbling down, due largely to the efforts of this man, an investigative journalist named Brian Deere, who found that he, in fact, despite the fact that that paper only had 8 children in it, it was a case series, not a study, that had received the MMR vaccine and developed autism within a month of receiving the vaccine, he found that he had actually misrepresented clinical and biological data. In addition, that he had actually received money from a personal injury lawyer where 5 of those children were actually in the midst of suing pharmaceutical companies, basically laundering legal claims through a medical journal. For that reason, and the amount of money was about $800,000 that he had received, but for that reason, his paper was retracted, which means technically it no longer exists, and he lost his license to practice medicine in England. But his paper had an impact. There were hospitalizations and death in the United States. Thousands of parents chose not to vaccinate their children. Hundreds of children were developed measles and were hospitalized, and 4 children died. I mean, you could reasonably argue that that paper killed children. And in the United States, parents of more than 125,000 children chose not to vaccinate, which caused outbreaks, such as, for example, the Disney outbreak. Doc says, don't be dopey, vaccinate your kids, because otherwise that can happen. And there was an outbreak that occurred in 2005 2014-2015 that ultimately involved about 25 states and 189 cases. Fortunately, there were no deaths. But times have changed. I mean, there was a movie that was released that was made by Andrew Wakefield and people who collaborated with him that released on April 1st, 2016 that was supposed to be shown in the Tribeca Film Festival by Robert De Niro, but actually the other filmmakers protested, and so it wasn't. And so this movie, which kind of made Andrew Wakefield out to be a hero, was never shown. And then, and it frankly was routinely vilified by the media, who talked solely about the discredited doctor who had promoted a debunked hypothesis. It was really dramatically different than what was the impact of DPT vaccine roulette or the impact of Hear the Silence. And then more recently, this was just released in September 29th of last year, a movie called The Pathological Optimist, which was made by a veteran filmmaker named Miranda Bailey. She had done Swiss Army Man. She had done a movie called Norman with Richard Gere. She's doing a movie now with Anna Gunn and Jim Gaffigan called You Can Choose Your Family. She is a major player in Hollywood. She shows in Sundance all the time. This movie came out in September and I suspect most people in this audience have never heard of it because it pretty much died the death it deserved. This is my last slide to say that I think studies in response to Wakefield's claims were done quickly and universally, which didn't happen with the pertussis vaccine. I think we were so blindsided that people would think that vaccines were doing more harm than good that we were very slow to do that study. I think we learned from the pertussis vaccine issue. So when Wakefield made his claim, there was really the first study came out within a month of his paper. I think scientists and science bloggers have taken to the internet and airwaves to counter bad information, and I think, frankly, crazy as this is going to sound, I think in some ways Wakefield was good for science because he was not only was he wrong, he was fraudulent and wrong, and I think when the anti-vaccine movement attached themselves to his star, at some level they got hurt by that, and sadly, nothing educates like the virus. I mean, those measles outbreaks scared people, and so I'd like to think that we can do education without actually having to come to this where children suffer, but unfortunately, maybe that is what it comes to. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Offit. And before our next speaker, I just want to remind you have cards in your hands if you have any questions, because it would be great if we could start filtering the questions down. The students on the sides, we'd be happy to take them if you just kind of wave your hand. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Joseph Capella. He is professor of communications at the Annenberg School for Communications. I believe I'm highlighting here his book called The Spiral of Cynicism, the Press, and the Public Good. He's going to speak to us today about misinformation in legacy and emerging media environments. Dr. Capella.
How are we making this go forward? Oh, that one. Okay, great. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Somebody mentioned that the last teach-ins they remember were in 1970. I was at Johns Hopkins University as a graduate student in physics in 1970, and I went to my first teach-in. This is my second. I can guarantee you I was dressed very differently at that teach-in than I'm dressed today. I want to talk about misinformation and the way in which it moves through society and why it has a certain kind of appeal to various individuals. And I want to make a few claims. First of all, I want to make it clear that misinformation has a kind of stickiness, and it's difficult to get rid of. One of the most famous cases here was Listerine mouthwash, which in 1978 was called before the United States Trade Commission to question its claims about its ability to deal with colds and to reduce the number of colds. And they were required to run a campaign against themselves, essentially, over a 2-year, 16-month period. And the campaign was a little bit effective, but still at the end of the campaign, 42% believed that Listerine was still an effective cold remedy, and 57% of the people said that it was still part of their purchase decision to take into account the cold effectiveness of Listerine. And in 1998, as Paul just mentioned, the Wakefield situation arose in Great Britain on vaccination and autism linkage, and he provided us with some really interesting data about that. And despite a very strong rebuttal in the 2 or 3 years in Great Britain before right after the article came out, still 25% of people believed the link, and some 40 to 50% said that the evidence about it was equal. In 2017, in the United States, parents with children under age 4, 43% of them still worried about the risk of side effects from vaccination, and the general public believe that as well. Particularly those with low science knowledge. We're all aware about the Obama birther claim, and it's still the case that 41% of Republicans in 2016, even high-knowledge Republicans, still believe in that claim. And of course, this misinformation is transmitted by the media. Now, the media are not made up of stupid people. These are very smart individuals, and they are not trying to undermine democracy, but they often repeat falsehoods and misinformation as a part of the process of debunking them. And part of the reason, of course, is that they are interested in information that is novel. It's the news that they're presenting, after all. And so it's novel information that they care about, and that gets their attention even if they don't present it. And unconventional sorts of claims are ones that they are most interested in, ones that run afoul or run against conventional wisdom. And they're, again, going to get closer attention even if that information is not communicated, or if it is communicated and it's debunked. And of course, the media is very interested in keeping it simple, stupid. That is, they are not interested in presenting detailed scientific claims with caveats and reservations and so on. They want the core information that's able to be understood by their audiences. And so they're not going to explain confounders on the relationship between vaccine exposure and autism later on. They're simply going to present the information that's presented by the parents in the group. And of course, the media is interested in balance because they want balance to represent their lack of bias. But sometimes even-handedness is itself a kind of bias, when in fact the science goes in radically asymmetric kinds of directions. Now, we all know that legacy media, the mainstream media sources, are just one way that information is communicated today. While the mainstream media are still the primary sources of creating knowledge and creating news, it's the dissemination of this kind of information and news that's occurring through other kinds of sources, such as social media. And a very interesting study just came out in Science, I mean, literally within the last few days, that looked at false and true news stories as represented as determined by fact-check kinds of organizations. And they looked at Twitter exchanges in 2006 to 17, and over 126,000, that is 126K, news stories that were tweeted over 4.5 million times. And what they found was that stories that were identified as incorrect went faster, deeper, and broader, especially political ones, but also science and health-related stories. And that the lies that moved through the system more quickly, more deeply, and more rapidly had characteristics of being novel and produced responses in the audience of fear, disgust, and surprise, consistent with their novelty. So social media, of course, is one of the problems that we have in the legacy media, in contrast to legacy media world. So why is misinformation believed in the first place? What is it that would lead people to not simply try to be as accurate as possible? Well, of course, they want to believe stuff that's consistent with their prior beliefs because there's less challenge. These are old ideas from dissonance theory and other sorts of points of view. They also are interested in misinformation that tells a coherent story. Now, coherence here is not necessarily a scientific kind of coherence, but rather a coherence within the ideology and within the values with which they operate. So, for example, if they believe that physicians are enthralled to big pharma so they won't give up vaccination very readily, that's a story. It could be completely wrong, but it's a story that makes sense to them. They also pay attention not just to credibility as expertise, but ordinary credibility, the kind of credibility that comes from direct experience, for example. And so mothers and fathers who present their tragic stories about their children offer a kind of experience-based credibility that makes sense to people. There's also the notion of consensus, particularly from people who are similar and give similar kinds of testimony. And we see this in the social media environment for sure. And there's a kind of preservation effect that occurs with misinformation. Not even when people are successfully led to not believe the core information in the story, there's a kind of emotional residue that remains. And there's been some interesting studies to show this in the political domain and increasingly in the health domain. Question is there anything we can do? My first message here is this first line, that facts and education are not enough. Simply telling people the truth, giving them the science, isn't necessarily sufficient to move that underlying information in a direction of disbelief of the misinformation and undermining the emotional residue that remains. This is not trying to create a propagandistic point of view from the health side of things, but rather to use persuasive tools and persuasive strategies to communicate information that itself has value and has truth. Second, don't repeat the lie. That is, it's almost impossible, of course, to debunk something without repeating it. But one of the worst, one of my favorite examples is an old example from Richard Nixon, who claimed in an image that's very much characteristic of his presidency, "I am not a crook." In claiming that he was not a crook, he brought up his crookedness. All right, and so one of the things we want to be careful of as communicators about false information is to avoid repeating the lie when we can. But if we have to, it's better to try to debunk and be persistent about debunking the lies that are out there. That works a little bit better than simple repetition of the lie, but we need to be concerned about that. A fourth possibility is to inoculate. For people who are potentially going to get an anti-vaccine message of some kind because they're in the business of giving birth or thinking about getting pregnant and so on, if we can inoculate them in advance against the negative messages that they might be seeing coming down the road, they can, in fact, have a chance to be cognitively inoculated against the arguments that might work against the health of themselves and their children. Be persistent, don't give up. The media effects are small and incremental, and so we can't give up doing what needs to be done. The alternative, of course, is to use the very kind of story messaging in a simple way that tells a truer story about the vaccines that we are concerned with, particularly from the point of view of the worldview of the individuals involved. So, for example, one of the worldviews of parents and potential parents is the health of their child. And so staying within that worldview and the health of other children, staying within those two worldviews and the values that they represent in the stories that we give them has a better chance of success because it's consistent with those worldviews. And if we can't quite tell the story, we can at least affirm that worldview before we carry out the debunking of the lie. Now, none of these are magical solutions. As I often tell people, if I had magic solutions, I would be extremely rich and have a Nobel Prize, and we don't have either. But they are at least potential lines of development in the communications world that helps us deal with the kind of misinformation that can be so problematic. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Capella. So moving right along, our next speaker is a graduate student getting his doctorate this year in the Department of Philosophy in the School of Arts and Sciences. He will be leaving us in the fall, unfortunately, but while he's here, we're going to extract a pound of flesh and have him come talk about his work, Race and Vaccine Acceptance. Dr. to-be, Justin Burstein. Oh, yes.
Hi, I'm going to jump right to it. So there's a disparity along racial lines concerning both attitudes about vaccines and rates of vaccination. So what's the explanation for this? Well, there are the usual considerations about socioeconomic inequalities and injustices in affordable access to healthcare, but there are also some distinctive factors that have been identified over the last 10 years or so. In particular, there's distrust of government motives, distrust of the motives of medical personnel, and awareness of one's race in a medical context. If you give a questionnaire to a group of Black individuals about vaccine efficacy and you prime them by asking about their race, their faith in the vaccine goes down afterwards, much like we see with something like stereotype threat. So just to make this a little bit more concrete, here are some excerpts from a qualitative study interviewing Black adults about the flu vaccine. When asked to describe why he has zero trust in the people who produce the flu vaccine, this man explained, because, why would they really care so much about us? Where they refers to the government. This distrust extended into conspiracy theories, including beliefs that the government was experimenting on minorities as guinea pigs, and that the vaccines were being diluted and distributed in Black communities, or that vaccines were a form of population control. It's worth saying a little bit about the Tuskegee syphilis study, what's technically called the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. I'm guessing most of you are aware of this study. It was started in 1932. The US government oversaw the selection of Black male sharecroppers with syphilis. The victims of this study were told that they were going to get a treatment for bad blood, which was a term used to refer to syphilis at the time. And by 1945, it's known that penicillin will cure syphilis, but the people involved with the study don't provide the people in the study with syphilis, with penicillin, and instead they just continue to observe as syphilis worsens in these individuals. This goes on until 1972, when the study is exposed. It's ended immediately. Here in 1997, Bill Clinton has just formally apologized for the Tuskegee syphilis study, and this is Herman Shaw, who's 95 years old, who is giving some words. Vaccine hesitancy among Black Americans is correlated with knowledge of the Tuskegee syphilis study. In short, vaccine hesitancy of at least some Black Americans is at least partly due to perceptions of racial injustice, either ongoing or historical. I contend that from an ethical perspective, this sort of vaccine hesitancy is importantly dissimilar to more commonly discussed cases of vaccine hesitancy, such as those who hold the false belief that vaccines cause autism. It's unlike these other cases because the distrust of Black Americans is reasonable. So my focus for the rest of the day is going to be exploring a tension between the fairness-based moral obligation to get vaccinated and Black American vaccine hesitancy due to reasonable distrust of government and medical professionals. In order to understand why there's this tension, it's worth saying a little bit more about the problem posed by vaccine hesitancy. So herd immunity poses a collective action problem. Each individual person going unvaccinated does not make a big difference to herd immunity, but if enough individuals go unvaccinated, the entire group loses herd immunity. So, given that this is a collective action problem, and assuming there's a moral obligation to get vaccinated, I assume there is, it's an obligation of fairness. More specifically, it's an obligation to do one's fair share in producing a good for everyone, namely herd immunity. We see these sorts of cases all over the place. Just to give another example, imagine during a drought, there's a water restriction that's been imposed by the government. Persons who don't observe that water restriction are violating an obligation of fairness. So, to solve a collective action problem, such as ensuring herd immunity, each person has to do their fair share. Now imagine that someone, Alice, reasonably thinks that others won't do their fair share in solving a collective action problem, and Alice has this belief due to historical or ongoing injustices. To solve, it hardly seems that Alice acts unfairly by not complying. So now imagine that a group, Alice, Bert, and Connor, will receive $100 each if they all participate in a trust fall. If someone lets someone else fall, however, that person will get $120 and nobody else will get any money. If two or more people let someone else fall, nobody gets any money. Alice knows that Bert has a history of letting women fall when engaged in trust falls. Even if Bert would not actually let Alice fall, and there's evidence that he won't, asking Alice to trust Bert amounts to asking more of her than of Connor, and it would be wrong to insist that Alice acts unfairly by not participating, even though this will cost all three of them. Similarly, asking Black Americans with the relevant attitude to trust medical professionals who ask them to get vaccinated is asking more of them than it is asking of white Americans, and it's asking more of them precisely because of historical and ongoing injustices. As such, it's implausible to claim that Black Americans with the relevant form of distrust have a fairness-based obligation to get vaccinated. So I'm going to put this point another way. Consider the following statements. Everyone has an obligation to do their fair share in producing a public good like herd immunity. Yes, government officials and medical personnel have committed overtly racist acts in similar contexts. And yes, the medical context is characterized by institutional racism. So it's reasonable to distrust the government or medical personnel when they recommend or require getting vaccinated. Yes, others don't have this reasonable distrust. Nonetheless, your fair share requires that you trust the government and medical personnel and get vaccinated. I think something's gone wrong in this line of reasoning. I don't think you can consistently hold all four of those statements. So what's the moral and political upshot of all this then? I'm not sure. To be clear, I'm very pro-vaccine. I'm not a vaccine skeptic. I'm on the record arguing that even the flu shot should be mandatory for children. But I think that this is a puzzle nonetheless. And I mean, this is a condensed version of a much longer paper, but in that longer paper, I make the sort of following argument. Black Americans with reasonable distrust are not obligated to get vaccinated, and forcing those individuals to get vaccinated is not fair. That said, emergencies, including threats to herd immunity, can justify government measures that are ultimately unfair. Nonetheless, we should recognize this as a case of unfairness and call it what it is, and perhaps some form of compensation is owed. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Justin. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Damon Santola. He is a associate professor of communications at Annenberg Center for Communications. He's going to be speaking to us about vaccine denial and social networks. And on the shelves, as of May 2018, his brand new book, How Behavior Spreads, The Science of Complex Contagions. So, Dr. Santola.
Thanks. This is the last talk of the day. Everyone just, stretch out, get ready. So what I'm going to talk about today actually comes from this book. So this book is really about the differences between the way diseases spread through social networks and the way the behaviors spread. And the topic of the talk and much of what I do in the book is to show that disease spreading and many of our intuitions from epidemiology interact in important ways with the way the behaviors spread. And in fact, behavior spreading in some senses can be a way of using the logic of human behavior to explain disease spreading. So the way that we typically represent networks in social science, and I'm a network scientist, so we have sort of archetypes that we think about when we think about the way that social networks kind of mediate the spread of viruses through a population. And one way of thinking about it is in terms of kind of an urban network, and you have people kind of bouncing around, interacting with each other in almost a random fashion. And we can contrast this with more sort of a suburban network, where people interact in kind of tightly knit local clusters. And what this means is that you kind of find local groups and suburban networks, and there's some overlap, but some groups are farther away than other groups, whereas in the urban communities, you have lots of kind of bouncing around of everyone interacting with everyone. So we, in network science, draw kind of cartoon-like diagrams, and people have probably seen figures like this, where when we try to characterize what an urban network is and what the networks are that might kind of mediate a diffusion process, we kind of draw this sort of random network of everyone kind of bouncing into everyone else. When we try to characterize the more sort of locally clustered suburban networks, we think of these kinds of networks, where we have these kinds of groupiness structures, and then they're overlapping, and they create kind of social distance in a community. Now, why this matters for disease diffusion is that when we see a community with here's an individual with the measles who gets introduced into the community, very quickly that disease propagates from that person to other people, and you can see it's not very well contained locally. Within a very short period of time, it sort of jumps all over the network. And what this does is it allows it to spread kind of throughout the population extremely fast. And then for an epidemiologist or a public health official trying to stop the spread of the disease, it's very hard to gain control of this once it gets introduced into an urban network, which is why we're always so concerned about diseases showing up in major cities. However, when we look at a kind of suburban population, we can look at the same kind of example of a disease being introduced into the population, and it can spread in the same fashion through the sort of social networks, But initially, it'll start to spread, of course, locally in one sort of cluster. Now, from a public health point of view, we can imagine sort of quarantining or sort of intervening to sort of constrain the spread of the disease. Of course, if we don't act fast enough, it can then jump to other groups and percolate through the population. But this gives us time when it's sort of percolating initially through a local cluster to sort of think about how we might want to intervene in some way to prevent the sort of widespread growth of an epidemic. Now, of course, our general strategy, as the previous speaker mentioned, is immunization. We try to sort of generate some sort of herd immunity. And what that really means is we try to inoculate enough people, a large enough fraction of the population, that if a disease were to be introduced, it wouldn't be able to spread because essentially the pathways would be blocked. And what that really means is that you have someone down here, the same person introduces the measles, but the disease can't percolate through the network because the contacts of that person or that person's friends or their friends of friends are all inoculated, and so it can't penetrate through the rest of the social network. The same logic actually holds in both kinds of network structures. So when we look at a more kind of localized suburban network, the same sort of immunization strategies work, and we introduce someone with a disease like the measles into that network, and again, the diffusion of the disease is stopped because of herd immunity. So while 40% of the population is still vulnerable, the 60% who are inoculated prevent the disease from spreading farther. So what I want to talk about is what the differences are between these two networks, which basically look pretty much the same, although the suburban network was a little bit easier to handle from a public health point of view when it came to preventing disease spreading. What the differences are, now that we think about the behavioral diffusion that arises when we think about people trying to mobilize an anti-vaxxer movement. So what is the difference between the spread of measles and the spread of anti-vaccination? Well, measles only requires contact for diffusion. In fact, it has a very high probability of transmission, close to 1. So, contact with one person with measles is very likely to transmit measles. And this is what makes those sorts of networks very effective for diffusion in urban settings. However, convincing someone not to vaccinate their children requires some degree of social reinforcement, some social pressure, basically strong peer communities that can enforce that norm and maintain it while it spreads from person to person. So in urban communities, that's harder to do. You can imagine people standing on the street corner in Philadelphia on your way home telling you shouldn't vaccinate your kids. How effective are they going to be? Now, that person, if they shook your hand, could spread the measles to you. But that person in one conversation isn't necessarily going to convince you not to vaccinate your children. You're going to talk to your friends and see what they're going to do. And so when we look at what this means for the effectiveness of herd immunity, we can introduce these people and start a diffusion process, but they're not going to be very effective, these yellow individuals, at spreading the anti-vaxxer belief through the community. And as a result, we can sort of go ahead and run our normal vaccination campaign, and then someone with measles shows up, and herd immunity is maintained, right? Things aren't really affected by it. The difference, however, in the suburban community is when you have a small cluster of anti-vaxxers within the same kind of localized area, they can coordinate and generate significant social pressure on their peers. And through that coordination, they can generate essentially a local critical mass of diffusion, right? And this generates a kind of cluster of very susceptible people. Now, we can still vaccinate the same way we would before, our same kind of immunization campaign, and the rest of the population would have the same kind of fraction of immunization as before. So we'd still get, in expectation, our herd immunity for the rest of the population. Now, the big question, I think the relevant question to ask is, what is the implication of one small pocket of anti-vaxxers for everyone else, right? It's fair to say people can, for themselves choose not to vaccinate, and, there are moral arguments on both sides, but one argument for people who aren't engaging in the anti-vax behavior is to say, yeah, but that's that community. It shouldn't really affect me and my community because we all vaccinate our kids, or at least there's a significant fraction of people who are. What winds up happening, however, is these anti-vaxxers create such a sort of large critical mass of vulnerability that then it can percolate the disease from that community through the next communities and the other communities. And as a result, what winds up happening is that immunization and herd immunity winds up becoming eliminated entirely. So just because the friendship group or the neighborhood network that I'm embedded in is not worried about the problem of vaccination, or we all vaccinate normally, it doesn't mean that people sort of several steps away who are engaged in a small community of anti-vaxxers don't affect us. In fact, it affects the population as a whole. And this is a really large consequence for thinking about the relationships between social contagions and the way that networks affect that kind of social process, which is very different in kind of the urban network from the localized clustered suburban networks. and the ultimate effects of disease spreading in communities. And so the punchline here is when we think about prevention, right, and we think about managing and understanding outbreaks, we really need fundamentally to understand how behaviors like anti-vaccination are spreading through social networks in order to get a grip on what our expectations are for epidemic outbreaks and how to prevent them. Thank you very much. That's it.
Well, thank you so much. We've had some great talks this morning. Please, if you have questions, please write them on the cards and pass them down to the students that are waiting to collect them. Before I introduce our honorary moderator today, I just want to announce that we have Dr. Helen Davies and the previous editor of the Almanac, Karen, I'm sorry, your last name? Gaines. Both of these individuals were also at the original teach-in 50 years ago. So we want to thank you so much for coming to today's teach-in. Okay, great. All right, so for those of you who are WHYY fans, you don't need any introduction for Maiken Scott. She is not only an outstanding health reporter, she's the senior reporter at WHYY, and she is the host of the newly syndicated radio show, The Pulse, stories about science, health, and technology. She also, you might have heard her voice with Dan Gottlieb on Voices in the Family for years. That's how I came to know Maiken, is through Dan Gottlieb. And so Maiken and I have had opportunities to be interviewed by her, and she is an incredibly a conscientious health reporter who really does work very hard to get the facts correct and to help the community at large to understand what it is that we do here in the Academy. And so I just couldn't think of a more appropriate person to come and moderate our Q&A, also to share a few words about her experience as a health reporter. So Maiken, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Neil, so much. I'm going to just say a few words, and then we're going to have our panel discussion, and I already have a few questions. If you have more, keep sending them down. I want to talk a little bit about, where journalists come from. I want to preface what I'm about to say by saying that journalists like myself are becoming less important. Our platforms are shrinking. Our audiences are shrinking, so more and more people are turning to other outlets for their information, like YouTube or any video channel. There are lots and lots of talk shows that have a somewhat similar format to what you might be used from public radio, but it's on YouTube and it's some totally different person hosting that show who's not by training a journalist per se. So we just all need to be aware of that the methods of communication are totally changing. So I recently asked my colleagues, have you heard of Jordan Peterson? And zero of my colleagues had heard of this man, right? When you go to YouTube, Jordan Peterson, who is a psychologist, gets millions of hits, right? So he is communicating to people, and most of the people I know have no clue who he is. So that's something to be aware of as we move ahead in trying to communicate science. In terms of why these big miscommunications happen, I think we have to understand what's the job of a journalist and what are we here to do, right? Journalists, by design, are here to find stories, right? We are here to find wrongdoings. We're supposed to be watchdogs, and we're supposed to believe people who are not necessarily believed. So we are supposed to listen to those who are voiceless and who've not been believed. And often, that results in some really good stories, right? And often we do that job and we find some injustice, and as a result, things change and things happen. But just when you communicate with journalists, just know that's our job, right? So when these vaccine stories came out and people started talking to parents, they are trained to find that story of the person who's been wronged and who's been hurt. And journalists by design are often people who do something that I call chasing the man. So it's like, we're here to chase the man. Whoever the man is, we're going to bring him down. So who's the man? We're going to bring you down. So when they see somebody who is relatively powerful, a researcher, maybe has ties to pharma is never super popular in the newsroom, let's be honest. Again, that comes from this perspective of chasing the man, right? Here's an industry that makes millions and millions of dollars, that makes them by design suspect to people like us. So that's sort of like the perfect storm that can create a scenario like that, right? And I think as researchers, just knowing that and knowing like, okay, this is what these people do by design and by training all the time, makes you better informed to have these conversations. To say to a journalist like, hey, I see where you're coming from, but I would like to caution you to take into account X, Y, and Z, and so on. So I think just having the conversations with people is very important, and reminding journalists that, yes, this sounds very persuasive, and I can see why this story sounds really persuasive, but can I explain this to you? That would be really important. That's the kind of conversation that I think usually goes a long way to result in better coverage. And I have had people call me out on things, and I've had people tell me, you oversimplified this fact. And I'm more, of course, prone to listen when somebody says, hey, I would like to point something out to you, rather than when I get an email that's like, you idiot, you blah, 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 right? I mean, I think we all function like that. So I think the relationships are very important. And I have, over the years in covering health and science, built some very important relationships. And I also now feel like I have a lot of people where I can just email them and say, what do you think of this? What do I make of this? But, a lot of us, a lot of journalists just feel a very big responsibility to listen to people who have a story to tell, even if that story maybe on its face doesn't sound credible. I still have the responsibility to listen to that mom who says, my kid got the HPV vaccine and now she has this, this, and this. I can't just say, that's too bad. That's not my job. My job is to listen to her and then hopefully do the right thing in terms of what I do with that information. I mean, journalists also, oftentimes we look for things and then we all start covering the same issue. I remember years ago, there was this just slew of coverage about teenagers hooking up. Does anybody remember that? It's like everybody is hooking up all the time in middle school, and kids are just having sex everywhere and every which way. And it was just this big crisis that was really like manufactured, but when you look for a fact and you look for a narrative, you find it. So there were 2 or 3 experts saying, that teens were like hooking up way more than they ever were. And then of course you can find kids who want to be on the radio and on the television, and suddenly we had this just amazing amount of coverage of an issue that a few years later completely went away. So, I think kids have always done what kids will do, but whatever. So we had all this coverage. So I think these things sort of like come and go. I also, one more thing I want to say before we get into the panel is that I think it's very important for scientists to be more proactive in telling the good news. I was thinking, as one of you was talking about the Zika vaccine, and I remember sitting in a newsroom, I remember very clearly all the coverage of the Zika crisis, but I don't really remember the stories about the Zika vaccine moving along and how amazing of a success that is, right? I just don't remember seeing those stories as much as I remember seeing the children and the babies and the stories that sort of punch you right in the gut. So I think there is a lesson to be learned to really be, when there is a success, to be shared and something exciting to happen, to try as much as is possible to tell those stories, because people need to hear those stories to build the trust that I think, people don't have trust in journalists anymore either, but, so I think there is a certain amount of trust that people need. And when they hear, oh, these people are working around the clock to help all of us, that to some extent instills trust in people. So whatever you can do to tell those stories is important. And I also think it's very important that scientists communicate more directly with people each and every day. There was a great hashtag on Twitter last year that was living scientist, actual living scientist it was called. And it was just scientists tweeting about their work, like, hi, this is me, this is what I do, I study X, Y, and Z. And it was really popular. And I think sometimes just going out and talking about the work you do and why you're passionate about it, if there's a church where a lot of people perhaps don't vaccinate, why not see if you can speak at that church and tell those people why you love what you do, why it's important, why you spend each and every day doing this. That is what makes people believe you, I think, ultimately, is when they feel the passion that you have, and the passion is ultimately motivated by making this world a better place. That's when people, I think, start to build trust. So I think it's very important for scientists to seek out those who influence others, those who could be friends in terms of getting the right message out, and then communicating directly through those pathways. So that's all I'm going to say, and I'm going to sit down here, and I guess everybody's going to come back up on stage, and then we'll do our Q&A, right?
All right.
Oh, do we have mics now? Or,
These are your
Okay.
mics. Okay. Okay. Okay, do you have any ones there that you want to go through first?
yeah.
Okay. I'll let you pick one.
All right. So we already have a bunch of questions, so let's dive right in. And the first one is a very broad one, so I think an important one, though. And maybe limited to one top thing that you think is the best way. The question is, what do you think is the best way to counter the anti-vax movement as it continues? So maybe think of your top one or two strategies that you think is most important.
Okay, I start. So obviously I talked in the presentation about this kind of diffusion phenomenon, the way that it affects larger scale percolations through networks. So my strategy, and a lot of the book is talking about this question, right? So what I've spent the last couple of years thinking about is, how do we design intervention that's really meant to target, like, promoting the spread of behaviors, or in some cases inhibiting the spread of behaviors. And there are ways that we can think about, much in the same way that you would introduce a vaccine into a community, not just to inoculate like some radius of people, but to imagine that by those people changing their behavior, there would be a diffusion process of this sort of new view of either a pro-vaccination view or one that was like actively countering anti-vaxxers. And so there's a series of, there's an entire chapter actually dedicated to how we might go about designing behavioral interventions to spread desirable health behaviors through communities, and that way, in some sense, prevent against the growth of anti-vaxxer movements, or in general, kind of anti-science movements. Yeah.
I would just extend that point to concerning various social networks, like social network media. So this is something that came up, like Facebook. It's dealing with this issue about how much should they regulate views that are false. And I would think that really addressing that issue head on might be a good first step.
Well, I have no particular expertise in this space. I would say that one of the things that I've been very impressed by is the right champion stepping up and helping. Scientists aren't always the best at talking without jargon that confuses people, and I think that that's really a great thing. I'm extraordinarily impressed with Paul really taking on the anti-vax movement and the autism issues, and that as one example. And so I think that's very important, that all of our voices are important to help get across reasonable policies and ideas.
Yeah, I would say it's more of a sentiment than a movement. I mean, my parents were children of the 20s and 30s. They saw diphtheria as a routine killer of teenagers. They saw polio as a crippler of older children and young adults. You didn't have to convince them to get vaccinated. I mean, similarly, I was a child of the 50s and 60s. I had measles, I had mumps, I had German measles, I had varicella, I had all those diseases. So I know what they felt like. You didn't have to convince me to vaccinate my children. My children are 25 and 23. Not only did do they not see these diseases today, they didn't grow up with these diseases. So for them, this is all a matter of faith. And frankly, it's understandable, I think, to push back on vaccines now. I mean, we ask parents of young children to get 14 different diseases, which can mean as many as 26 inoculations in the first few years of life. It can mean as many as 5 shots at one time to prevent diseases most people don't see, using biological fluids most people don't understand. I think it's perfectly understandable that people are skeptical about whether they really still need them, so we need to explain ourselves. And where the rubber meets the road is when they get the vaccine. So the nurse and the physician that's giving the vaccine, I think what has to happen is it's not, as many of these other speakers have said, it's not just a matter of facts. I think it's a matter of being passionate, of saying, look, let me love your child. Don't put me in a position of practicing substandard care. Don't ask me to send your child out into a world where there's more measles, more whooping cough. Please don't put me in that position. So I think, and medical students are really not trained that way. I mean, they're trained to be much more open-minded, to all sort of cultural beliefs and attitudes. And so it's hard for them to lay it on the line, to be prescriptive. But I think it's what they need to do at some level. So that's where I see the rubber meeting the road.
So let me segue a little bit upon what Paul just said. Part of what was implicit in what he was claiming was that there are worldviews that people and value systems that people bring with them to the interactions with their physicians and also in the interactions with other people, and making one's arguments within the context of that worldview. You care about your child. You care about other children. And that's an important way to tell stories that I think can be effective. But the other thing we sometimes forget about, and this is really an unfortunate set of ways of making a dent in the problem, is paying attention to dramatic events. So when there is a measles outbreak, taking advantage of that as a problem that could have been avoided, in the same way that we have seen this in other kinds of health contexts, all the way back to Katie Couric getting a colonoscopy because her husband was taken away from her. And that produced a substantial, demonstrable increase in colonoscopies, at least in the short run. And that was a dramatic event that got a lot of play. And so those dramatic events can be effective if we take advantage of them. Unfortunate as they may be, they can be turned to good.
Can I follow? I want to follow up on what Paul and Joe said with a question for you. So both of these speakers pointed out this really important thing, which is known as like the prevention paradox, which is if we successfully immunize, what you'll see is nothing, right? And so the problem is it's hard to say, look, we succeeded, nothing happened, right? And so actually, exactly what Joe said, there's these counterfactuals. There's, what would have happened if we hadn't done it. Now, that's extremely hard to communicate to journalists and to say, well, we have a prediction of how bad things could have been, and they weren't. Look how successful we are. Now celebrate us, right? And it's hard to celebrate that in the press. So I'm curious how you can,
Right. Yeah, and I don't have a very good answer to that, because I agree that it's a big issue. We oftentimes see a problem, and however small it is, we bite into it. My old boss used to joke that 3 makes a trend and 5 makes a crisis. But that's sort of like in a newsroom, when you see something like 2 or 3 times, you're like, oh, there's something going on, let's report on that, right? But that's always a problem. That's not the absence of a problem. So I agree with you that it's very, very difficult to communicate the absence of a problem and the success of something or the success of a policy. But I think, again, when a measles outbreak happens, and I've seen people really do that successfully, to use that opportunity to communicate, this is why it's important,
Right.
and this is why it matters. So it's to sadly jump on the difficult situations, but then to use them wisely and to communicate that. Part of the reason why we don't often see that is because most of the kids are vaccinated. And I'll say one more thing. I think as a parent, the thing that maybe I was not worried about vaccines, but the thing that really put me at ease was when my pediatrician said, this is the schedule I followed for my children. And those were the words that completely put me totally at ease with what he was about to do, because you do have those fears when there's a tiny baby and all these needles, you get a little freaked out or whatever. So I think those are good things to say for pediatricians. It's just like, this is what I've done, or this is what I would do. We have another question about direct marketing, and I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in on, or maybe just 1 or 2 people. It's about getting information, health information, directly from from farmer advertisements that hit us sort of like on social media all the time, and whether that dilutes the message or gets people confused about side effects and drugs they should or should not take. So, and does that potentially contribute to the distrust toward vaccines? Paul, do you want to take that?
So when the varicella vaccine came out in 1995, the uptake was slow. So the company decided to do more direct marketing, and it's really one of the first for direct marketing, and it was pretty hard-hitting. Can't believe I lost a child to varicella. Showed pictures of hemorrhagic varicella. They were criticized for that by a number of people. They felt it was too heavy-handed. But the fact remains, immunization rates went up because of it. The HPV vaccine also has been very slow to have an up. I mean, this is a cancer-preventing vaccine. There are 29,000 cases of cancer and 5,000 deaths caused every year by HPV that can be prevented by the HPV-9 vaccine. Yet, only about 45 to 50% of girls get fully vaccinated and less than that for boys. And a third of those cancers are in boys. And so Merck basically came up with a I think, a brilliant strategy of having this sort of go back in time. So here's someone with cancer who wished I had gotten a vaccine.
Yeah.
With it.
I just saw that.
Yeah, and that actually has helped. And they too have been criticized for that. So what do I think? I think that, I mean, as you said before, it's pharmaceutical companies are never going to be seen as benign. They're always going to be seen as in it for a profit. But the fact of the matter is, they make. I mean, personally, I mean, I was fortunate enough to participate with a team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. They created the rotavirus vaccine. I mean, there was I think Neil showed a picture. It was me and Fred Clark, but Stan Plotkin was also part of that. We wanted to make a vaccine to prevent rotavirus. Now, I mean, this is a virus that kills 2,000 people a day in the developing world. It causes about 70,000 hospitalizations. It's a bad disease. We had the technology we thought that could prevent. Now that said, only pharmaceutical companies have the resources and expertise to make a vaccine. If you want to make a vaccine, you're going to have to protect the technology, i.e. patent it. Then you're going to have to go to a pharmaceutical company to make it, because they're the only ones that can make it. So now what? Now they're making a vaccine that they think can help people. And as David alluded to, we used to have 27 vaccine makers in 1955. Today we have 4 because it's a terrible business. It's something you give once or a few times in your lifetime. Their biologicals are expensive to make. They think they're making something that's of value. And so isn't it reasonable for them to stand up and say, we think we have something that's of value? But you're right. The minute it's them, you see them as evil. And it's too bad, because I mean, what should we have done differently? I mean, we had to patent this because it's the only way, unless the technology is protected, it's never going to be made. So what do you do? I mean, you're in an environment where where these companies are seen as evil, where people who say the HPV vaccine has caused chronic pain or chronic fatigue syndromes are going to be seen as sympathetic by you. They're the David and the companies of the Goliath. And it's an unfair construct, I think. But
Yeah.
but whoever gets praised for standing up for at least this aspect of the pharmaceutical industry, right? I mean,
And we love an underdog,
send me your
right?
hate mail. I don't know if you've seen my website.
Another question, I think this one is for Justin, and it's about, there are other groups, for example, Puerto Ricans, who have been exploited by the medical community. So how do you think about those groups and those populations, and how one could rebuild the trust and restore faith in sort of science and the medical profession?
So it sounds like there are 2 questions there. The first is, what do you do about the other groups? The second question is, how do you go about rebuilding trust? With regard to the first group, I mean, I picked Black Americans. I did not mean that to be exclusive in terms of who has reasonable distrust. I was just picking that to highlight the phenomenon. As for how to rebuild trust, I mean, I think I'm not an expert on that, but I would think there are a couple things we could do. One thing is, I mean, there are just still rampant inequalities in our healthcare system that are along racial lines. Maybe, ameliorating some of those would go some way towards eliminating some sort of distrust. I mean, I think your story, Maiken, about physicians sort of cultivating trust by saying, look, I mean, I've heard of physicians saying, this is my child who I vaccinated. They have a picture of their kid. I mean, sort of cultivating a relationship of trust with the physician might be one way to go. But I also think, I mean, 25 years after Tuskegee, better late than never, I think acknowledging this sort of history and having it be very open and talking about it is important. I don't think we should try to sweep that under the rug, because that's just going to eliminate trust.
We have a question about vaccines specific to Philadelphia schools, but I think this is true across the country, that often families who refuse to vaccinate come from higher economical and higher education backgrounds. So how do those two connect? And, so we cannot tie more education with more vaccination. So how do those things connect? And what do we do? Oh, what do we do about it?
Yes, I guess I'll start. I think people have studied this. You're absolutely right. I mean, who chooses not to get vaccines? It's generally a Caucasian, upper middle class, often upper class person who has been at least college educated, often graduate school educated, who has a job in which they exercise some level of control and believe that they can Google the word vaccines, frankly, know just as much as anyone who's giving them advice. That's the person that you're dealing with. I mean, it's I guess the term, maybe educated's not the right word, schooled is the right word. Because, I mean, if you really look at the data, I mean, when people say to me, for example, I've done my research on the varicella chickenpox vaccine, I've decided not to get that vaccine. But what does research mean? What research really means is they look at people's opinions on the internet. That's what research, that's not research. I mean, if you really want to research the chickenpox vaccine, you should read the roughly 700 articles that have been written on the chickenpox vaccine, which would require you to have some working knowledge of virology, immunology, statistics, epidemiology. And most people don't have that. Frankly, most doctors don't have that. So what do? They rely on advisory bodies like the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, the CDC, or the Committee of Infectious Diseases to the American Academy of Pediatrics, which at least collectively have that expertise and collectively have read those papers and collectively make decisions that have saved our lives. I mean, vaccines have been good things over the last 200 years. We live longer because of vaccines. But sell that message in the 21st century, right? Trust us, we're experts. Doesn't really work, even though it's true. So I'm not sure how to deal with that. When people say to me, I've done my research, I already cringe because it's really not what they mean.
Right.
Can I build on that point also what Lynn was saying earlier? So I think that when we look at the marginalized populations, particularly when it comes to communities that just don't have tremendous institutional access to healthcare, one of the things that we found effective, and we've done studies in the last 2 years on HPV vaccination, we've done is fairly straightforward. We've created communities on the internet that are basically composed of people who have similar demographic characteristics, right? And basically created these communities as a way of filtering out a lot of the noise that might otherwise come from institutional signals that might not be trusted, and just creating a kind of space where people say, all right, you're in a kind of similar situation as me. The technical term social scientists use is called homophily. It just means people with similar characteristics, right? But there's this kind of empathy that's created by seeing people who are like you, just by the fact that they're in a similar situation. You expect them to have the same levels of distrust of the institution, and you expect them to be making the same kinds of calculations that you're making as opposed to somebody else. And what's remarkable about this is we've had like really significant effects by putting people into communities where there's actually more baseline distrust in those communities. And then you kind of see the discussion, which encourages people to think about HPV vaccination, and you see significant changes in behavior over the course of 6 months, versus a situation where you put people into a community where you've got some kind of opinion leaders, right, who advocate for it. But there's so much distrust among the majority of the population of who these opinion leaders are and why they're saying what they're saying, that it's actually much less effective.
Yeah. Anybody else on this particular question? No? We have a question for Joe. How can scientists convince lay people who are not science savvy that vaccines are safe?
Well, one of the ways that vaccines have been undermined is through the telling of stories that appeal to the individuals who are being targeted. I think the same strategy works in reverse, and that is the telling of good stories that are simple stories that operate out of the worldview, out of the identity system of people in the target audience. Again, none of these and keeping at it, not simply saying, well, I tried this story and it didn't work, but keeping at it. So I think there's no magical solution and there's no 100% solution, just like there are no sometimes clear-cut, unequivocal diagnoses from particular kinds of tests. But similarly in the social sciences and in communication sciences, if I'm putting my money on anything, I'm putting my money on telling stories, using testimonials from similar others, and making those stories and testimonials come from the worldview, the identity view of people in the target population.
And I think something that, there are a lot of basic science concepts that I think people don't fully understand. And one of the most important ones to me is always causation and correlation, and I was joking last week that the Philadelphia Flower Show does not cause snowstorms, even though it might appear that way, because every year when the flower show happens, there's a big snowstorm, right? But I think people struggle with those concepts, and a lot of journalists who end up covering these things, they don't always cover science, they cover everything. So to them, it seems like, oh, that seems fairly reasonable. Like, here was this person, and then you did X, and then Y happened, so X and Y must be connected. So sometimes I think just going back to the most basic of concepts that you guys deal with all the time and are sort of in your blood, but to other people, it's just not that much on their mind, and to them that might seem fairly reasonable.
Can I ask you a question about
Sure.
that? Since, I think of you as like an expert on the panel as well to help us figure out how to communicate this stuff more effectively. So a lot of the big problem with science is that it's not intuitive, right? And that's why we do science, right? And otherwise, we would just use common sense all the time, right?
Right.
When common sense fails us is when we need to do scientific research. So then that leads into the natural sort of paradox for journalism, which is what you're trying to do is to motivate an intuition that the audience can get behind, right? And so a lot of our sort of common sense intuitions from Facebook, from Twitter, from like what we see, lead us in the wrong direction, which is why, the systematic evidence is interesting. Right, so you might expect this, but it's hard to make that land for an audience. I can give you an example of just one thing we did recently, but analyzing, this was related to the cervical cancer study, HPV tweets, right? And what features of the tweets make them more likely to propagate, right? And so we all have this really, really clear intuition that like personal experience, right, narrative. And it's true that when we did is a controlled study where we created a little kind of self-contained Twitter environment and manipulated features of the tweets versus comparing that to just a large observational data set from Twitter. So what you find in the large observational data set is this kind of contradiction where on the one hand, you see this very significant effect of personal experience. On the other hand, you see a very significant effect of organizational messaging versus personal messaging, right? But from like individuals versus organizations, those two things don't go together. So what we find is that in a kind of a controlled experimental study, that the biggest successes in terms of the big winner tweets were the kind of individual personal narratives. But in terms of like a systematic regular effect across hundreds of people over and over again, the organizational information tweets were more likely to be repeated, right? So you got the occasional big winner, but that's not systematic. You can't build policy based on that. The regular systematic effect was organizational messaging, right? So all of that is conflated in observational data, and it's hard to sort of tease those two things apart. And so how do you tell that story when everyone has sort of a clear intuition from their experience?
Right, and people want to hear things that they already
That
believe.
they understand, yeah.
So, I mean, how many people right now are not eating gluten for absolutely no good reason, but because, I mean, that's another thing that people are spending millions of dollars on right now for probably no good reason, right? So I think.
Wait, can I just say one thing? Sorry, I disagree a little bit with what was said before. I think,
I was waiting for you.
first of all, I think science is at some level intuitive. So, for example, I think we're all scientists. So, for example, your radio doesn't work, and so you formulate a series of hypotheses. It's not plugged in, it's not tuned to an active station, it doesn't have a battery in there, and then you proceed to test those three hypotheses. That's scientific thinking. It's a logical, ordered, hierarchical thinking. I think when what I love about the pulse is I think it's a very clear, logical sort of explanation for what's going on. I think it is quite intuitive. Science isn't the province of scientists. I think it's the province of all of us. And I think the reason the radio isn't working isn't because the flower shows moved into town. And that's what I don't like about sort of some journalists who do sort of entertain that sort of difficulty with causation versus correlation.
But I think there's another very basic concept, and then we probably have to wrap up, right?
No, we've got 4 minutes.
4 minutes, all right. I think there is a very basic concept that people misunderstand about science, and that is that the science is a quest, and the quest never ends. And people will say, well, last year you said X, and now you're saying this, and eggs were bad for me, and now eggs are good for me, therefore you're all stupid, and I don't have to listen to you. I mean, that is what happens in the minds of people. So I think just making sure that people know this is the very nature of science, is to continuously disprove that which we thought was true yesterday, and to not think that we have arrived, but to keep searching and to keep knowing, and to be transparent about that process, and to say, look, these vaccines have been tested to the absolute best of our knowledge, and here's what we have done. But, if by chance we find out there's a problem, we will apply that same rigor to that problem. We're not going to hide it from you, but this is what we've done to get here, and this is our process. And for people to understand that process more clearly would be huge, I think.
You're right.
I think this next question is also.
Do you want to just say it?
Oh, sure. So basically, the writer is interested that once misinformation is insidious, and once it's out there in a journal, such as like the Wakefield piece, we had all these publications that then said this was wrong, debunked it. How is it that journals should be responsive, and what should we do to try to enhance working with journals to get them to stop, either promoting inaccurate information, and if they do, to do more to debunk it. So like that was in the Lancet. The Lancet retracted it, but could the Lancet have done more?
Well, first of all, there are 6,500 medical and scientific journals, and the number of predatory journals only increases. There are 4,000 medical and scientific papers published a day. Not surprisingly, they follow a bell-shaped curve. Some are excellent, some are awful. Most are more or less mediocre. You can get anything published. You can. And then you can say, look, it's published in the medical literature. I think it's hard. I think the question is, what makes this notion go away? What makes the notion that the vaccines cause autism go away? I guess I would draw an analogy to sort of diabetes. I mean, type 1 diabetes. So in the 1800s, nobody knew what caused type 1 diabetes, and there were all these crazy ideas as to what could cause it and how to cure it. And then in 1921, Banting and Best discovered insulin, and all of that went away. I think until it's clear what are the causes of autism, we're always going to be living with this, because we don't have anything else to offer, really.
Right.
Yeah, I would also say we're sort of in a dynamic situation now. During the slides I came across, there are many fewer large vaccine companies. They're really the only ones that can really take on extraordinary large projects. There's a change in our populations. We're much more at risk because unlike just which was very clearly outlined, the herd immunity situation, we have people who really cannot participate in vaccines now, and that number is quite large. It's probably more than 20% of our population. And so, one of the things we haven't discussed is that it's very selfish in a way for us. And all of us probably are touched by cancer, they're probably touched by autoimmune disease, we're touched by many other conditions, HIV. There's 1 million people with HIV in this country, and other diseases that are affecting our immune system, and they are out of the vaccine population, but they are at risk. And so it's not just about us. So one of the things that's very upsetting to see a lot online is when different individuals will state, well, it's not safe, as if it's only about them. And I think they're really at quite tiny risk, no matter what way you want to look at it. But the rest of us and our populations that are in this hospital are not. And so I think that point of view is not always discussed or addressed, and it's one that I think is also important.
Yeah, very important. Last one?
Joe, you had another comment?
Yeah, one of the issues that's clearly been raised here is a core issue for the communication of scientific and health information, and it is that science has a certain degree of uncertainty to it. It has a process orientation to it. It is an open system of inquiry that can be changed, and we are often faced with the communication of uncertainty. And one of the things that we have not done a good job of as a field of study is trying to address how to communicate to the public in the face of uncertainty. When that uncertainty takes the form of evidentiary uncertainty or uncertainty about conclusions that are reached and so on. And we have to address that problem in a serious way at all levels, whether it's at the level of the interaction between the physician and his or her client, or at the level of public communication campaigns, or in the news. And that's, I think, a line of inquiry that would profit all folks, to how to minimize the negative consequences and frustration and cynicism about science and about what scientists can say and should say and need to say in the face of continuing uncertainty.
On that note, I'm going to ask everybody to give our panelists and Michael Scott back here in the reception area. Lunch is available for everyone. And I hope to see each of you at another 1 or 2 or 3 teach-in events across the week.
Nice to meet you. I have to run right out. I have an interview
teach-in.
back at the station.
Oh, wow.
When is that book coming out called? The next
It was so lovely to have like a journalist perspective. Cool.
Oh, good.
Yeah, really useful.
We're chasing the man.
By the way, I think that the counterintuitive thing I brought up, I disagree with Paul on this. So I think that engineering is one thing and science is a different thing. So we can learn engineering.
I'm sorry, the disparity of rates, as I listed, is for flu vaccine for adults.
When we understand it,
Adults. Yeah. There's not any, I don't know about in children.
we don't know why they break. We have guesses why they break, right?
Right.
And so the kind of the frontier.
I mean, yeah, so the tests were run on adults, and then there was also, there's a further breakdown by age that I just didn't include because, but I was thinking of this extending to the flu vaccine in particular.
Yeah, of course.
That's where a lot of the data comes from. If you,
Are you from the world or from where? Where are you from?
I'm sorry?
Yeah. I will. I'll do that.
I appreciate you coming. It was a very calm audience.
Yeah, no, totally.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, so the MMR, this is not, maybe I should have made that clear in the talk. I had the difference in attitudes was documented.